I am a huge fan of The Simpsons. I'm a huge fan of The Simpsons Hit and Run, and if you're watching this video, you probably are too. But did you know The Simpsons Hit and Run has a surprisingly active modding community, with like-minded fans of the show giving new life to this nearly 20-year-old game? Yep, 20. Sorry to make you feel old. I've got a whole series dedicated to trying them out. Some change the game's visuals, others update the story and missions, and then there's some that do that. And over time, I've been thinking to myself, I should give this a go. I'm no modder, but hey, you gotta start somewhere, and why not start with one of my most favourite games of all time? I like a challenge, how hard could it possibly be?
I've made a huge mistake.
Step 1. I need an idea. Let's start with some baby steps. No new crazy plot or mission, since that would most likely involve code and scripting, and I do enough of that for a day job. No thanks. Let's settle for something more visual. Even if there's nothing to do, a change of style is always fun to try out. In my previous mod spotlights, I've mentioned how taking something from the show and making it playable was a fun concept. You can already kick Lenny, but you can't punch him in the back of the head. Maybe I could mod that. Nah. Ooh, how's about an interactive sing-along of Superstar from Lisa Goes Gaga? Huh? No one's interested? Okay. Well, I played a mod not too long ago that made the Treehouse of Horror segment, where Lard Lad and mascots come alive, into playable missions. Come to think of it, Treehouse of Horror segments are a good source for mod ideas since they're quite small and they're self-contained. What would work well in The Simpsons Hit and Run? A 3D action-adventure game. 3D... Oh, hang on a moment. Yes, Homer³, the final segment of Treehouse of Horror 6, seemed like the perfect idea. In it, Homer escapes a visit from Patty and Selma behind the bookcase, only to end up in a mysterious new world in which everything is 3D. The mod can be purely visual changes, plus there's not terribly much to model, and being able to walk around the creepy grid zone yourself seems like a bit of fun. Let's do it. Okay, where on earth do I start? Well, just to be clear, I'm going to gloss over a lot of the minute detail in this video because I ended up spending hours watching tutorials, skimming through the Donut Team forum, and just using trial and error to make this mod. Suffice to say that I wouldn't have been able to do this without some of the amazing tools and resources created by the modding community. I'll try and credit where possible and link to them in the description below. Anyway, since this was my first ever go at modding, I figured it would be best to try and utilise as much existing material as possible. For example, I downloaded a basic mod template from the forums which laid out an initial folder structure and some key config files that were necessary for it to run. You know, a place to store character files, vehicle files, level data, scripts and all that jazz. For the map, well, all it had to be was a giant plane, but thankfully I didn't even have to make that, as I found a flat map used for the Simpsons Hit and Run online multiplayer. Yep, that exists apparently. So we've got Homer standing in the middle of a giant flat green grassy world. Great. Let's add some traffic. To have cars and traffic, we're gonna need roads, despite what Doc Brown says, and since this is a video game, at the end of the day, it's all just a bunch of ones and zeros. But thanks to an add-on by the modder Weasel on a Stick, I was able to import the level map into Blender to easily visualise and alter it. If you're curious as to how the road system looks in The Simpsons Hit and Run, it basically looks like loads of dots stitched together. The road-looking things are, well, roads, with an arrow signifying the traffic's direction. The long thin rectangles next to them are where pedestrians spawn, but we'll get onto that later. The big spheres joining the roads together are intersections, and all this stuff can be moved about and tweaked using the property settings on the right hand side. You can change the number of cars on the road, the speed that they drive at, if they drive through intersections or stop first, the list goes on. Frankly, I was overwhelmed at all these different settings and numbers, so I ignored all that and just started moving some roads to see what would happen. And that's when I learned that this whole modding malarkey is merciless. Crash after crash after crash. And why? Because this road system is no joke. There are rules that you need to follow precisely. Roads are split into segments, giving you the ability to curve them, but each segment has to line up perfectly to the one next to it. Roads have to start and end with intersections and be tagged accordingly, so thank God for this eyedropper tool. Make sure the ends overlap into an intersection, hold your breath and just hope you didn't forget anything. Well, eventually I got my head around all these criterias and ever so slightly moved the roads. Success! I'd made the traffic awkwardly shift over a bit and caused some minor injuries for the innocent bystanders. With lessons learned, I set about making my own road network from scratch. But the question is, what should it look like? The 3D world is set in a giant grid, so it only made sense to try and replicate that. Even better, it meant no fiddling about with curves or bends, and the traffic would flow in nice perpendicular angles, giving it that computery programmed feel. I started off small to make sure it was actually working, and voila! Traffic had spawned, and was now crashing into each other a lot. Nah, you can't win them all. I'd made the grid too small and thin for the cars to fit, it seemed. But anyway, I'd had enough of roads and grids for the time being, and I needed a break. Let's look at pedestrians instead. The good news was, compared to cars, spawning pedestrians was far simpler. As mentioned, they can either spawn on a line or a bounding box, and just wander around to their heart's content. It was a case of adding a few of them into my level data, booting up the game, and there I was, kicking away instantly. You customise the specific characters that spawn using this PED group code, so with a simple edit I soon had the entire Simpsons family wandering around the grassy abyss. And now for the biggest benefit of basing this mod on Homer³. Modelling was
easy as pie. The number, that is.
Yeah, thanks. But really, as much as I like designing and creating stuff, 3D modelling on the other hand has never been a strong suit of mine. Back at university, my course had included a 3D modelling module. Well, just look how that turned out. Not great. That being said, at least I had a basic understanding of how to model and what certain terms meant. I'd used 3ds Max back then, but of course Blender is now the go-to free alternative, and after a few tutorial videos I was ready to model. Okay, ready to model is a bit of an overstatement. The inhabitants of this mysterious 3D world Homer steps foot into are all just basic shapes that I could create instantly with a couple of clicks. Sure, that one's a teapot, but that's not any old teapot, that's the famous Utah teapot, and can be found in pretty much every 3D modelling software as a standard reference object. Anyway, I started off with a cone, and to make sure I got the scale right, I first imported the model of Homer into Blender as a reference. After a little bit of scaling, transforming and exporting later, and would you look at that, we've got a cone walking among us. And now it's running. Can cones run? They can now. Anyway, I'd forgotten to smooth it, the texture was a placeholder and it clips through the ground. But I don't care, it was my very own cone, and I loved it like it was my own. Afterwards I added in a cube, that Utah teapot, and tried extruding some text to make the floating equations found in the episode. Soon enough the level was populated with badly textured shapes and maths equations. Equations that had curiously foot-shaped shadows. Let's move on. We now had all these shapes mingling with the regular old school bus and pickup truck. That's no good. We were missing some vital shapes like spheres and cylinders, so I took an existing car model, swapped out its body for a simple cylinder, and ended up with this monstrosity. But hey, it's drivable at least. A little more tinkering to remove the wheels, lights, skid marks and shadows later, and we had ourselves a cylinder car. A very top-heavy cylinder car, but a cylinder car nonetheless. I did the same for the sphere, which was equally as prone to toppling over, and then picked a couple of equations to add too. It was then I noticed a slight issue. The vehicle shapes had been big enough to hide Homer's model when he entered them. The equations were not, which resulted in this. Not exactly the look I was going for, and it was facing the wrong way. Thankfully there's a config setting for almost everything in this game, including character visibility when driving, so with a quick edit of 1 to 0 and a bit of rotation, I added another equation with much better results. But the time had come, I couldn't put it off any longer. I had to return to... I'm really not going to spend much time on this bit because frankly it sucked. I had to increase the size of the grid, and because I wanted lots of 90-degree turns, I couldn't just scale it up. Instead I had to go in and connect up intersection after intersection following all the same stupid rules from before. There's probably a far easier, more efficient method of doing what I was doing, because I ended up with over an hour's footage of me mindlessly clicking away and probably getting repetitive strain injury in the process. To make matters worse, when I finally finished, it didn't work. Just like before, crash after crash. I checked and checked again for any rogue vertex out of place, but no luck. It was only after the more drastic measure of deleting a huge chunk of it that it finally seemed to work. And the reason for all this pain and suffering? A couple of measly config settings. Yep, that's right. Settings I'd somehow managed to completely miss before, which meant I was now going over the number of allowed roads and intersections in the game's programming. I upped the limit and my woes were over at last. I added in some extra pedestrian spawning zones and then had a think about the size of the map. I wanted an invisible wall for my level so you couldn't get too lost. Invisible walls are called fences in the game's programming, so I added a big square around my map, exported it and never looked back. Good riddance to that. I thought about what else I could add to the level to give it some more life and interactivity, and remodelling the wasps seemed like an obvious choice. But remodelling them to what? Well, what do wasps have? Stingers! And what do stingers look like? Cones! And what hits Homer in the... Okay, yeah, you get the idea. Unfortunately, not all ideas work out. I updated the mesh and tried to remove as much of the glowiness as possible, but they still didn't look great. Plus, they still sounded like wasps. I messed around with them for a bit, but ultimately I scrapped them. But the idea of cones attacking Homer still appealed to me, so don't worry, they'll make a comeback later on. So the map was filling up nicely, but it was missing something pretty obvious from the Treehouse of Horror segment. This building. Now it's time for Fun Facts with Muckluck. Did you know this building is the library from the original Myst game released in 1993? Well, I didn't until now, and I call myself a Simpsons fan. And a point-and-click game fan for that matter. This was glorious news to my ears because it meant that there was probably a model of it available to download somewhere on the internet, and I could continue being lazy. And what do you know, there it was, the Myst library modelled by Cyan Inc. on Thingiverse. I imported it as an SLT file into Blender to position it correctly, and then exported it as an XML file, which for a model like this one looks terrifying by the way, and finally added it as a static entity onto the map. I should probably give a quick mention of the software I'm using to import all these models and textures for everything. It's Lucas's Pure 3D editor, and frankly it's amazing. Without it I'd be absolutely nowhere. I booted up the game and oh my goodness, there it is. Okay, so I spawned inside it. It's absolutely humongous and has no collision whatsoever, but it's there! That was all far simpler than it had any right to be. Until I tried texturing, that is. I had attempted to give it a marble texture. I'd done so with the cube model and that worked great, but when I did it here, it just ended up being a solid grey. Not wanting to lose motivation, I left that problem for future Joe, and instead looked at the collision. Collision in the Simpsons hit and run is done through various simple shapes known as chunk types, which consist of boxes, spheres, and cylinders. To make something have collision, you just need to build a simplified version of it using these chunks and add it to your map in the same position as your detailed model. For example, this is the collision model for the Krusty Burger in level 1. A bit of copying, pasting, transforming and scaling later, and I had this weird looking model ready to sit under my nice one. Soon enough I could crash into it and jump all over it. Great stuff. Now, how about those textures, or lack thereof? Well, I'm going to cut a long story short. It was the UV mapping. UV mapping is the process of projecting 3D surfaces onto a 2D texture. It's basically how you get textures where you want them on a model, and it was something I had stupidly overlooked. This model's thousands of faces were all crammed together trying to share the same texture, which I guess was just kind of breaking it. It was a case of separating out sections of the model, isolating just the side pillars, the roof, the steps and so on, and giving them each their own UV map so they could use the texture more efficiently. The handy Pack Islands function in Blender made short work of that. And if none of that made any sense, that's fine. Rest assured I got the library's texture looking nice, and in the process even managed to clean up the topology, so it wasn't such a mess. I'd call that a success. Riding high off the library model, I wanted to make more from the segment itself, which included the signpost that Homer comes across indicating the axes of this trippy 3D world. And hey, since lampposts are already a thing in the game, all I had to do was copy the files for it and give it a quick remodel. By this point I was getting pretty confident with Blender, having gained a solid understanding of it all through my previous trial and errors. In fact, that library texture problem was a blessing in disguise because it made texturing this post and getting the X, Y and Z in exactly the right position as easy
as pie. The number, that is.
And in no time at all, there it was in game. Now that we had signposts, it meant we also had coins to deal with. I needed to update their model to better match the theming of the mod, but what to? I pondered for a bit and eventually focused on how the coins fly towards you once you get close. They almost shoot towards you. Shoot, like a bullet.
We need action. Take that, you lousy dimension!
Yeah, you guessed it, the coins were going to become bullets. I know, it doesn't really make much sense that a bullet would pop out of a signpost, but hey, it was the best I could come up with. My confidence in Blender took a hit, however, when I tried modelling a bullet myself. I made it this far before giving up and just downloading one off Thingiverse once again, this time from the user Jared New. I replaced the old coin model, added some gold and silver shaders, and hey presto, we've got bullets. There was one more standout thing in the episode I had left to incorporate. No, not the giant wormhole unfortunately, but the swimming pool instead. At first I was content with ignoring this feature, since how on earth would I get water working in the game, never mind the fish. Well, let's scrap the fish because that's way too much detail for what was meant to be a simple first step into modding. But what about the swimming pool itself? Surely there has to be something similar in the main game. And what do you know, there is. Krusty's mansion in level 1 has a pool, which it turns out is just an animated texture that kills you. Apparently Homer can't swim. I dug into the game's files to find the pool and copied it all over to my own mod. Turns out it's actually two planes, one featuring the animated texture and another blue one underneath it to give the water some depth. Copying them across had messed up their positioning, but that's fine since I still had to make the outer rim for it anyway. Again, I tried placing it in roughly the same location as the episode and moved the water texture on top. Yeah, I know the collision isn't great and Homer is literally walking on water, but hey, just call him Jeebus.
Save me, Jeebus!
Now for the biggie, texturing. Sure, we've got all this cool stuff in here, but it doesn't really look like the episode with green grass and a bright blue sky. Let's start with the ground, which is thankfully a grid, so very easy to tile. It took a few goes to get the scale right with the size of the squares on the ground, but eventually I matched it close enough. Of course, there's no dynamic lighting in the Simpsons hit and run, so I tried my best to fake a glow using, you guessed it, the outer glow effect in Photoshop. Since the 3D world is all dark and creepy, it only made sense to copy across the Treehouse of Horror skybox from level 7 as a starting point. Better yet, that included the slightly adjusted sunlight values, which gave the mod a nice green tint for added eeriness. Before we continue, I have to ask, does the game look a bit strange to you? Are things looking fuzzy and making your eyes go a bit funny? Yeah, mine too. I'd noticed a major problem, the moire effect. As the grid texture moves towards the horizon, it was producing this weird, distracting effect that I didn't like one bit. How did the show handle this? Well, they faded off into black. How could I achieve something similar but without altering the texture, since it has to stay tileable? Idea 1. I remembered a mod I played called Storm over Springfield, which featured this cool effect to mimic fog. Taking a guess, I assumed this was done by putting a big semi-transparent sphere around the model of Homer so it always follows you, and I tried making that myself. It didn't really work. Idea 2. Since the real issue is seeing too far into the distance, what about if I slightly curve the edges of the map downwards to hide the texture from view? Good idea, I thought. But that soon resulted in this mess, which I quickly undid out of fear of breaking everything permanently. Undo, undo! Idea 3. Third time's a charm, right? I needed to fade the grid texture into black around the edges, but I couldn't alter the texture itself. So what about a completely separate texture ever so slightly above it? Ahaha! I made a vignette in Photoshop and applied it to a giant plane positioned above the grid. It took a bit of jiggery pokery to get it lined up right, but hey, it worked! Finally! The horizon now fades nicely into black and is far less distracting on the eyes. As an added benefit, it's also a nice visual indicator of where you are on the map, since it turns to solid black right at the border. It was time to get rid of those pesky witches flying about, and the hills, and the mountains, and the moon. The stars, they can stay, and so could the clouds, but they needed a bit of work to match the episode. To me, they looked a bit like the wispy lines of the Aurora Borealis, so to begin with, I tried photoshopping that into the cloud texture. I kind of forgot how much it repeats at weird angles, so it ended up looking like a streaky mess. I figured the background was throwing me off too, so I finally changed that into a nice gradient of deep blue to black, and then it struck me. If I wanted the clouds to look like the episodes, why don't I just use the episode? Bingo! A couple of screenshots later with some blending in Photoshop and hey presto, we had a pretty darn accurate skybox, if I do say so myself. I moved on to finishing up the cars and pedestrians using more marble textures or solid colours for them. If you take a look at how they appear in the show, you can see they've got a certain amount of shininess to them, or in a 3D model's case, specularity. In the pure 3D editor, you're able to define the specularity of a shader by assigning it an environment map, which is to say a texture that represents what the object is meant to be reflecting. You can then adjust the alpha level of that map to control the shininess. White is high, black is low. Think of it as a fake way of making reflections. I'd done that for a few shapes, but they still didn't look quite right. They were shiny, sure, but their reflections didn't match their surroundings, and they didn't really sit within the environment realistically. The reason for that was because I was using the game's original environment map, which featured clouds. I wanted my shapes to reflect the main light source of the level, which in this case was the grid itself. So it was off to Photoshop to spherise the grid texture and turn it into this. And boy, would you look at the difference. Now the shape actually looks like it's reflecting the ground rather than just having a generic shininess applied to it. I was on the home stretch and I was ready to move on to what I thought was going to be one of the final steps. Sound effects are kinda hard to make look interesting in a video, but rest assured I went through and tried to replace any sounds that didn't quite fit with the Treehouse of Horror theme. The most obvious example was the music that played as you were driving, the all too nostalgic track called Sunday Drive. Using some tools created by the lovely folks at Donut Team, I meddled with the sound files, replacing Sunday Drive with the music that played over the episode's credits, which I also had to clean up in Adobe Audition. It was then a case of going through and muting little things like the tuba sound when you enter and exit a vehicle. At one point, the shape started yelling at me, so I had to go in and mute those lines too.
Hey, get your face out of my face!
Speaking of which, in doing so, I discovered some very strange unused traffic dialogue.
Don't make me get my board with a nail in it!
Okay then. Kicking sounds were way too fleshy, so I glitched them up a bit. That's more like it. The ambient track that played was from level 1, which featured birds tweeting. It was all far too lovely for this creepy 3D world. So I made my own using some spaceship-like white noise. I even threw in a few of those little grid whooshes that you hear in the episode. Finally, I spliced in a few quotes from Homer in the segment as you run about the map. Come on, there was no chance I was going to miss including
Holy macaroni!
And with that, I was finally finished. Everything was done. Right? Right? You know how they say the last 10% of a project usually takes as long as the first 90? There I was thinking all that was left to do was package up this mod and start writing this very script you're listening to. Oh, how wrong I was. The more I was ready to stop, the more I kept finding things to improve or new ideas to implement. In any case, I ended up squeezing in all this at the very end. Changing the car physics so they drove nice, creating a fake mission with no objectives so you don't spawn in a car, changing the default car from the family sedan to a sphere, turning off the hit and run meter, hiding the minimap, removing idle engine sounds from the traffic, adding a fancy camera pan to the level's opening, adding branding to the mod's loading screens, adding a small clip from the show to play before the level loads, oh, and then re-implementing hit and run completely using a cone as the police car. Watch out, I told you the cone would return. Ooh, okay, now it's done. And this time I mean it. Homer cubed in the Simpsons hit and run. Or as close as I could make it for my first attempt at modding. Could it be improved? Absolutely. I could have added the wormhole, bar, or something to actually do in the mod, but for a first go, I'm pretty proud of it. Walking around the map really does feel like the Treehouse of Horror segment, and better yet, I learned so much about modding in the process of making it. Who would have thought that modding a game from 2003 would be so difficult and time consuming, eh? Having said that, so much work was made easier using the tools created by the Hit and Run modding community, so a big thank you to them. If you'd like to play the mod yourself, I'll be adding a download link for it soon, so check the description or comments and I'll pin it there when it's available. Don't forget you'll need the Lucas mod launcher and a copy of the game on PC to play it. If you enjoyed this insight into my first ever go at modding The Simpsons Hit and Run, please do give it a like, and if you haven't already, consider subscribing so you don't miss any more Simpsons content in the future. Believe me, after having done all this, I've now got a few more mod ideas up my sleeve. I've got a full playlist of all my previous mod spotlights, and I'll be making another one soon playing this one. It'll give you the chance to see the mod properly and give me a chance to ramble about making it more informally, so stay tuned for that. Okay, that's enough plugging. I'm off to go buy some erotic cakes. See you next time, folks.